Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the Walt Disney Company's and Marvel Studios' latest entry in the MCU, has rocketed off into theaters this weekend, and I'm going to give you some thoughts in a non-spoiler review. But the bigger story right now is looking at some Marvel brand damage that has obviously happened, because while this movie has overperformed slightly, at least, initial projections for this opening weekend, it's still far behind what the Walt Disney Company and Marvel Studios would have hoped for certain. Let's get into it.
Renegade Online.
Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many folks watching this video, not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. Marvel Studios' Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 was a solid entry, especially when you look back at the first two films and how beloved they were, releasing in 2014 and 2017, respectively. And while those two previous entries were far more lighthearted than this third, this latest one has a lot of charm all on its own. However, that being said, I'd probably caution fans of the first two that this third one is probably not going to be the emotional ride that they expect. Many of the themes in this film are rather dour and heavy, but they are peppered in with a lot of lighthearted humor that we would expect from stellar performances of the entire cast. But even with the serious emotional nature aside, this is the type of movie that should have led off phases 4 and 5 for Marvel and not been buried in the middle of it. Because being buried in the middle of it obviously had a tremendous impact on the box office this weekend after too many bad Marvel titles that have come before it in the last year and a half. And it seems like that pleasant surprise from even more casual fans is what drove the Rotten Tomatoes audience score to a 95% for this film, and that has certainly had an impact on the box office this weekend. But as I mentioned in the intro, even though the movie performed, or at least is expected to perform at this point with Sunday estimates, slightly better than initially anticipated coming into this weekend, it's still far below what Disney expected, and quite frankly, still far below what Disney needs on an opening weekend for a film like this to cross into financial profitability. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, with a $106 million domestic opening weekend just a couple of months ago. Guardians of the Galaxy is not expected to outperform that by much more. And frankly, I find that a bit strange. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 should absolutely be able to blow Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania out of the water, and yet it isn't. Before that, it was Black Panther: Wakanda Forever at $181.3 million on its domestic opening weekend. Before that, last summer, Thor: Love and Thunder with $144 million. And then, of course, we got Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness with a whopping $187.4 million on its opening weekend. And as we continue to remind folks, that was largely due to the impact of Sony's Spider-Man: No Way Home, which came just a few months before it. It pushed a lot of goodwill into that movie that, quite frankly, without Spider-Man being immediately before it, there's no way that movie would have gotten anywhere close to that opening. But what's key to understanding that I continue to remind folks is how much of the final domestic box office haul do the opening weekends actually represent. That's what's getting very concerning for MCU titles. With Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, that $187 million only legged out to about a $2.25 to $411 million, somewhere around the low 40% range. Then there was Thor: Love and Thunder. Again, somewhere around the low 40% range is what that opening weekend represented of the final run, and again, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever with $181 million to $453 million. You guessed it, the opening weekend represented, once again, around the low 40s in terms of percentage of total run. Then Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania really went off the rails. Its domestic opening weekend of $106 million finished up at around $213 million. That means that almost 50% of the entire box office run here in the US and Canada happened in the first 3 days. That is what we call some extreme front loading. And that has continued to be a very negative trend for these Marvel released titles, and that's what gives me some very big concerns about what the extended run of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is going to look like based on what we just saw happen in the first few days. Let's look at the first two Guardians movies, though, to see what's changed over the years. Guardians of the Galaxy in 2014 opened at $94 million, and it finished a very strong $333 million. That was very strong for almost 10 years ago now. That box office of $94 million in the opening weekend represented about 28% of the final box office haul, and the $146 million in the opening weekend of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 represented 38%. So you can see in just a few short years how much more front-loaded these Marvel movies became. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, of course, if a movie like that opens with a large enough opening weekend to where even a 2X might get you to 800 or 900 million, which is exactly what we saw in the case of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. But since then, that really hasn't been happening, and the leg-outs have been steadily getting worse and worse. Now, I think that the audience reaction, the very positive word of mouth that this latest entry, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, seems to be getting, is going to help it push it past maybe what is a new normal for Marvel. Maybe it gets back to the 2.5x. Maybe it gets to 275, potentially even 3, although that seems like a very outside chance, as beyond Spider-Man No Way Home, which was a Sony title, we haven't seen a Marvel Cinematic Universe title leg out to a 3 in forever. But why is getting to $800 or $900 million for a movie like this so important? So many other movies out there in the theaters do far less than that and are very successful. But as I continue to remind folks, Marvel movies are not like most things that hit the theaters. In fact, they're in a league of their own. Every single one of these things, especially for the last couple of years, has been hitting with a $200 million or more production budget. Even the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie back in 2014 came with a whopping $170 million production budget. At least that's what was stated. And as we've also learned as time has gone on, Marvel and Disney have consistently seemed to understate what they actually spent. You see, a budget is a budget, but what was actually paid to finish a film is oftentimes very different, especially in the case of Marvel. Let me show you. From January 27th of 2015, this from Forbes magazine, Disney reveals that the Guardians of the Galaxy, that would be the original one from 2014, was over budget at $232 million. Whoa, that's a bit more than 170 that's still stated out there on places like The Numbers, isn't it? Yeah, because 170 million was the budget. That's what Disney anticipated spending to make the film, but when it was all said and done, it was actually about $60 million higher. So if we look today at Guardians of the Galaxy 3 and a stated $250 million budget, that's only 18 more than what they spent almost 10 years ago. It seems pretty unlikely to me that Disney actually came in at that budget. And that's been happening time and time again with especially later Marvel entries. It's one of the big reasons I think that Victoria Alonso was fired early. So in other words, it wouldn't be at all out of the realm of possibility to presume for a moment that the actual final price tag on Guardians of the Galaxy 3 may have exceeded $300 million, given what we know about Disney's history and reporting budgets. But even if we assume that Disney and Marvel Studios was able to come in on time and on budget at $250 million, this movie still needs to get to about $800 million just to break even at the box office, because that would also include another $150 million or so. Another very common figure these days for Disney to spend on global prints and ads, that's $400 million in all-in costs. And that's why these films need what they need just to break even. There's really not much financial life for these products after the theater anymore, as Disney consumes all of their own movies and puts them onto Disney Plus, as opposed to doing third-party licensing to places like Netflix and Amazon Prime, where they can make much more money over the long run with these. And going to Disney Plus so quickly also tends to sour the sales of things like premium video on demand, sales, and rentals, as well as physical media. The domestic box office stands at the final Sunday estimate of $114 million. It's about $4 million more than they were anticipating coming into the weekend, which is a positive change, but not very much of one. The international box office, however, outperformed a little bit more. Thinking that the weekend would bring in around $150 million, it's now at $168. But as I will remind folks, that international box office is not 3 days, but 5. And if we head over to Deadline Magazine, just dropped from Anthony D'Alessandro, Guardians of the Galaxy rises to 114. What does this mean for the summer box office? Guardians of the Galaxy 3 held it together on Saturday with an estimated $38.7 million, just 20% off from its Friday Plus previews figure of $48.2. And again, that Friday previews figure included about $500,000 from Wednesday night at 100 select IMAX locations in the US and Canada. This will get the James Gunn-directed MCU swan song to around 114 this weekend, higher than the 110 we were spotting earlier in the week. Essentially, and logically, that great heat out there for the film kicked in. Global is at $282 million, with $168 million from overseas, which ranks as the 50th highest global debut ever for a movie. And Intelligence says that there were 8 million admissions in the US and Canada for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 versus 7.2 million for Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania during its opening weekend. Now, certainly things came in better than expected, but I will say it again, that is still far short of what the Walt Disney Company and Marvel Studios would have hoped for this weekend, considering the massive budget for this film. Only having 800,000 more butts in seats on the opening weekend for Guardians of the Galaxy versus Ant-Man, to me, is just not enough. It should have been probably at least a couple of million, double or triple what that difference was. But it's just not there. And again, I think this goes back to an issue of Marvel brand damage that has been done to this franchise in the last couple of years, with frankly very poor efforts put out by the Walt Disney Company to this point. And as I've stated before, when you have so many bad movies in a row, even a great film like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is not going to be immune from the effects of those predecessors and the loss of fan interest up to this point. And as we stated in the last video, there was a higher amount of female audience in this new Guardians of the Galaxy 3 than previously. And that is due largely to the fact that many of the guys have just checked out. It's not that more women showed up. If that were the case, then the domestic box office this weekend would have been significantly higher than it was. But it isn't. If this movie legs out like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, we're looking at a final tally that's going to be somewhere just shy of $600 million. If it legs out like Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, we're looking at closer to 640 to maybe 650 million. And if it legs out globally at a 2.5, then we're looking somewhere close to 700 million. And that's why this movie, even at $282 million on its opening weekend, 3 days here in the US, 5 days internationally, really needs to get at least to a 3x to have a shot at breaking even. Again, that $800 million mark is probably the minimum at this point that it needs, and that is going to go up the more heavily weighted that something like China is in the mix, because that yields the lowest return back to studios compared to everyone else. About 55% here in the US, about 42% internationally ex-China, and then China itself at around 25%. Can this movie do it? Well, frankly, if there is any movie to this point in the Disney-distributed Marvel Cinematic Universe's Phases 4 and 5 that can get over this crazy hump and a relatively soft opening weekend, then it's probably this one. But that doesn't mean that it will happen. There's a lot of competition coming out in the next few weeks that's going to hinder this. At the end of the day, I still think this movie is going to finish itself up somewhere in that 650 million range. And considering how much I actually enjoyed the movie, that's kind of a shame. But this is what Disney and Marvel Studios have done to themselves to this point. But let me know what your thoughts are. Have you seen the movie, or are you planning to see it? Tell me what you thought about it. And on that note, give me your predictions for where the final global box office will land for this film. I want to hear from you. Make sure you join us this afternoon on the live show at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be talking about Guardians. We're going to be talking about the writer's strike and a few other things going on right now over at the Walt Disney Company. Make sure you join us for that one. And until then, take care.